All right, Sam, I'm going to be honest with you. When you hear Mastercard podcast, you're probably expecting a dry talk about a credit card processing company and corporate governance.
They're certainly a global giant, and we did sort of wonder, are we just gonna get PR speak or things like that out of them? That wasn't the case, though. We had a good conversation.
Exactly. When we sat down with Johan Gerber and Chris Merz, two of the leaders of AI at MasterCard, what we found underneath is it's one of the most battle hardened AI environments on the planet. Sam, they're doing things at a scale that makes most frontier startups look like they're playing in a sandbox.
The numbers certainly were pretty amazing. I think it was 160 billion transactions a year that they're doing. They're doing them really quickly.
That's right. When you tap your credit card to make that payment, the entire transaction decision takes about 300 milliseconds. But the AI model, it's only gets about 50 milliseconds to decide.
Yeah, it's like faster than a blink of an eye to do a whole bunch of different checks and go to your bank and get approval from your bank, all these kinds of things. The other thing that I found that was really interesting was the whole thing about scamming the scammers and sort of like this adversarial war that's sort of going on where people are using AI to defend, but others are also obviously trying to use AI to attack.
And Mastercard is leading this effort to use GenAI to create these honeypots that engage the scammers in a conversation, wasting their time until the AI has time to trick the scammer into revealing their bank accounts, right? So this is a war at global scale. Well, let's get into it.
This is VentureBeat's Beyond the Pilot, Enterprise AI in Action. I'm Sam Witteveen.
I'm Matt Marshall.
Today's episode is presented by Outshift by Cisco, Cisco's emerging tech incubation engine and driver of agentic AI, quantum, next-gen infra, and beyond.
Today, we're talking with two leaders architecting AI at a truly global scale. Johan Gerber is the EVP of Security Solutions at Mastercard, where he brings a background in law enforcement to the fight against financial crime. Chris Merz is the SVP of Data Science at Mastercard. He's the technical leader responsible for building the org and the models that power Mastercard security. What makes Mastercard's story so compelling is their beyond the pilot success. They've been shipping AI for decades, and their flagship fraud model, DI Pro, is a case study in production AI. Now they're blending that battle-hardened infrastructure with new generative AI to go on the offensive. Welcome to the show, Johan and Chris.
Thank you for having us, Matt. This is a real honor to be here.
Thank you.
I'll start with you, Johan. I wanted to start with your background because it's not typical for a payments executive. You spent a decade in law enforcement investigating organized crime. How does thinking like a criminal change the way you design an enterprise AI security strategy?
Yeah, Matt. No, thank you. I always joke that perhaps I got so lazy of chasing the criminals, I figured technology must be easier to stop them and from doing this in the first place, and so that was a big impetus behind the change. But no, long story to your point, I started my career in law enforcement, and then shortly after that, I got involved in some of the fraud investigations, got involved in some of the banks in South Africa, helped them with running fraud. That's where I really got my first introduction to expert systems. How do you look at transaction monitoring and the understanding of how criminals think and how our technology should emulate that actually became the foundation for a lot of how we were thinking about product development after that. And then interestingly enough, I moved to Europe, joined a company called Europay International, which was managing the Mastercard brand in Europe back in the day. And that's where I, for the first time ever, got involved in this thing called AI through a professor named Akli Adeoti, who was the founder and CEO of Criterion. And when I listened to his story, I realized this is going to change everything for us. And that was really where I shifted from our franchise world into product development and just started getting involved in this wonderful new tech.
Johan, it must be really interesting going from that sort of background, which I'm guessing is sort of focused on very specific cases, to going to Mastercard, where you're kind of trying to cover everything across the world. What was that sort of experience like?
I think that's the whole thing. Here's the interesting thing, Sam. If you think about the volume of transactions we process on our network, 160 billion. If you take that and you think about an occurrence that should be a 1 in a million occurrence, that happens to us 160,000 times a year, right? So that's the scale. That's what this brings, and that's the scary part of it. But that's also the exciting part of how we can really impact change through technology. And I think that's, if you think about the power of AI, the ability to basically customized down to the individual transaction. That's the exciting piece that really, from an innovation point of view, that just drove the aha moment to say, if we can do that at that scale and at that speed, this is a huge unlock. And that's really what spurred a lot of the drive behind we have to solve this problem.
Johan, you talked about friction by design. Most tech companies want to remove friction. How do you use AI to create the right friction? The kind that stops the scam, that doesn't annoy a customer.
Yeah. Friction is so important. First of all, we will not be on this planet if it wasn't for friction. We'll all be flying out somewhere in space by now. But so friction is not a bad thing. I think friction by design for me is the concept of introducing friction to underline trust. So think of this in the form of, I want to get into an Uber to get to the car, or in a Lyft, or whatever your favorite company is, to get to the airport. Zero friction is a really, really good thing. But somebody needs to move $10,000 out of my bank account. Friction is something I actually appreciate, that my bank will put it in there, because it lets me trust that somebody cannot just do this. So that concept, if used in the right way and at the right time of the flow, actually underscores trust, I think, in the mind of our consumers, that somebody's got my back. There's something that will make this hard for criminals to just get away with.
And Chris, to build that strategy, you need the technical engine. You've been at Mastercard for over 20 years and have a background in machine learning going back to the late 80s. You've had a front row seat to AI's entire revolution, from a niche field to a core of global finance. How has that journey shaped your philosophy on how to actually build and organize teams to deploy AI?
When I first started at Mastercard, they didn't even know what to do with people like me. They didn't even have the name data science, right? And half the time, folks on the product side were fighting over us, or the engineering side were fighting over us, and the other half, they were pushing us away, didn't know what to do with us. I think one thing that I've seen the most is that AI is really its own lane. It's not only that, it's the middle lane. If you're ever on one of those roads where there's a middle lane, you can go in either direction.
In the beginning, when Chris and I was talking about, if we just had more computing power, and then we got to more computing power, which empowered, deep learning and those kind of things. And then the next thing, generative AI came, and they just transformed. Now you've got the beautiful thing of, abundance of computing power, plus these new techniques. And I think that was the thing of beauty, where in the past we were like, man, we know it's there. If we can just get more cycles through this, we can get more accuracy and more out of this. It's wonderful to see. And then there's that steep curve of innovation just really got us there very quickly.
The thing I find fascinating is just as you're getting more computer power, though, the bad guys are also getting more computer power. And my guess is that the threats over those 20 years have changed massively. You probably look back on things that used to be a big deal 10 years ago and think, oh, that kind of thing is nothing now. Can you talk about how that sort of escalation of almost sort of like an arms race, where both sides get better and better at this adversarial game?
It's fascinating. I tell you, I remember days when we were talking about techniques that were called skimming, where somebody at a restaurant would have these devices on their belts, and they would, secretly skim your max stripe of your cards. We had things that we called Lebanese loops, where somebody would take literally an old camera film. Some of our viewers here may be too young to even remember something like a camera film, where they put it into an ATM slot that would prevent the card from getting out. All sorts of really intriguing things. And I was actually reflecting on this the other day. In the past, we were talking about the evolution of crime. Now we're talking about the evolution of tech and what that enables. And the lines between cyber and crime, how they just completely transformed the way in which criminals have access to infrastructure, computing power, new techniques that now fuels a whole new cycle of opportunities for them. And this is the fascinating piece, because the impact of AI on deepfakes, on agentic type of attacks, from a cyber point of view, from a social engineering point of view, it completely changes the game. And my biggest fear is that the consumer is the one who's most vulnerable, which is why, when Chris and I get together and we talk about these things, we feel that important mission, that as we see these transactions, we need to do what we can to protect that ultimately at the end of the day, irrespective of what happens. And we take the security of our network really, really serious, because the way we're thinking of this is our merchants out there, so the businesses who create these beautiful shopping experiences, they should be able to innovate. Consumers should be able to go and buy. Nobody wakes up and say, I want to use my card today, but they say, I need to go and do something. I need to go and buy something. So let that happen. But the moment they get into the Mastercard network, that embedded security, that's where we live and breathe most of our time. How we bring this to fruition. So whether they come through a social engineered mechanism or something that was hacked, ultimately, if it transforms itself into a transaction to monetize by the criminals, that's where the AI should help us to say it stops here. So whatever we cannot prevent, this is the layer where we're going to stop it and detect it. So, but yeah, it's fascinating how things have changed. The sophistication with which criminals are coming at us now, it certainly makes us sleep less at night, but it's exciting as well from a technology and just an innovation point of view.
So we want to move into the actual applications you've built in production, but just before we dive into those models, can you both just again frame the scale you're operating at? I think, Johan, you mentioned the hundreds of billions of transactions that kind of leads to a certain number of fraud and hacking incidents across the network. So when we talk about Mastercard scale, what does that mean? Can you go over the number of transactions, the data points, and kind of the high level elements such as the speed that you have to make a decision to counter these bad folks?
Sure. Well, let me start with maybe the transaction scale, and I'll let Chris talk to you a little about all the variables and the data points. He will have more to say about that than I have. But on the transaction side, we are processing roughly around 160 billion transactions a year. At peak periods, I've seen this happening, interestingly enough, around the 23rd of December is typically the peak, is when people like me realize, oh my gosh, I still haven't bought that gift that I'm supposed to buy. Seems like there's a lot of folks that are having the same problem that I have. So we see a lot of our peak seconds and our peak minutes around the December timeframe, or around Black Friday for that matter. We've seen that gone up to things like, up to almost 70,000 transactions per second. So that's the kind of frame within which you need to think through, from the flow into our AI systems, and then the latency that we have. It's about 300 milliseconds
Total.
Yeah, 300 milliseconds from the moment that transaction hits the platform, putting it through our orchestration in and out of the models back into the network. So there's not a lot of time to do this. So the throughput is pretty important for us as well, because remember, you as a consumer are sitting there, you've just clicked buy, or you've just swiped or tapped, or do whatever, how you interact. All of that happens while you're standing and waiting there for that response to come back, while we're doing all of this.
One of the things I found out recently that was fascinating was that Taobao is sort of retraining their models 9 times a day to be able to make the best recommendations for sales. My guess is, on your side, you guys must also be sort of updating those models a lot more frequently now than you were a few years ago.
Yeah, there's some really interesting, fascinating challenges in this process, updating them regularly, because we see changes in the way criminals behave, or new transaction types that are getting introduced. So when agentic AI comes in, the models will need to know what that means. But you even have other operational things. Sam, for instance, I remember this very clearly because it causes a lot of pain. But years ago, we had a scenario where one of the acquirers of one of the largest gas stations in the country decided to change their identification numbers of these gas stations. And so our profiles completely went out of whack. All of a sudden we saw this brand new entity that was just, showing this massive amount of transactions. The models went haywire. And so over time, Chris and the team have found the techniques. We control, there's 150 million of these merchants or acceptance points across the world. They can always change in the way we do it. So we had to find ways to build resiliency and robustness into the model. So as those things change, and those updates, helps with that a little bit, and just to smooth out those curves. I'll give you a real example of why this matters. So let's say we have a bank who's got a team of fraud analysts who are reviewing these alerts that we send them. So our aim is to look at every transaction in real time, and then we provide a risk score on the likelihood that this transaction will be fraudulent. Somewhere out there's a bank that says, look, I want to see all transactions where the risk is higher than X. And based on that X, we have a review rate, meaning they expect a certain number of transactions to end up in the queues to be reviewed. Now, given the volumes, if you have, millions of transactions a day, and you have a 1% change in those volumes, it could completely flood your operational queues, meaning that you can't get to the right one. So these things have very real implications for so many of our more than 20,000 banks across the world. So it's a very interesting operational challenge to try and measure this. So those updates that now happens weekly, very, very important for us to calibrate, also to improve the performance, to understand new transaction types. So it's a really fascinating part of the tech.
This series is presented by Outshift, Cisco's emerging tech incubation engine and driver of the Internet of Agents. an open, interoperable internet for agent-to-agent collaboration. Learn more about the Internet of Agents and explore how agentic systems are the future at outshift.cisco.com.
So we've already slipped into talking about DI Pro, which is your main AI application. So let's get tangible. So this is your flagship AI-driven product, right? Um, Johan, maybe just taking a step back, in simple terms, what problem does it solve, and what were the metrics that proved it is now beyond pilot, I should say.
Yeah, that's a great. This is a great thing. We are so excited about this. So the fundamental problem that we're trying to solve here is trying to assess in real time. So while you as a consumer, when you've just clicked buy or you've just tapped your card, in that time that you wait for the transaction to come back, to help the various stakeholders along the path to make a decision as to whether we should allow that transaction or not. And so that is predominantly based on what is the likelihood that this transaction is fraudulent, that this is not yours. And I sometimes equate this to finding a needle in a needle stack. It's not a needle in a haystack. It really is, because if you think about what these criminals are doing, they're trying to mask that transaction to look very similar to the way you and I buy. So it's really not like you're looking for these anomalies. You're really looking for something that looks very similar, or is by design similar to the way the consumer is spending. So the problem that we're trying to solve is find those transactions at the scale that we operate, like we said earlier, with a very short period of time, less than 250, less than 300 milliseconds to really make that decision and the determination. Now, what we do is, when we do the assessment, this is our model scoring the DI Pro that scores the transaction, we basically stick that score into the message. So basically, when you tap or when you click buy, the transaction passes through Mastercard, goes into our model, goes back onto the network, and then goes onto your bank. Your bank ultimately will make a decision to say, yep, we're going to allow this, or not. Or in some cases, they delegate the decision to us, but it's based on their criteria of how they want to do it. So that's in essence the problem that we're trying to solve with decision intelligence specifically. We have other models that we call safety net, which looks at more of holistic brute force attacks on our networks and so forth. But DI Pro is specifically looking at each individual transaction and the risk associated to it.
So Chris, can you tell us a little bit about that DI Pro model? So I understand that that's not a generative model at the moment, or that's something like an RNN kind of model. Is that right?
Yes, it does at the core rely on a recurrent neural network. And the one way of looking at it is in mapping it into the generative AI framework, where you could think of a recurrent neural network as a poor man's transformer. It's doing something like a pattern completion exercise. And so we look at how merchants relate to one another. And we map this in like that. So a recurrent neural network is understanding the way our merchants network together. So two merchants have a stronger connection if they have more common customers. And if you start connecting merchants like that, you get this nice kind of a roadmap of our merchants. And then what we do with the algorithm is we take where you've been before over a certain window of time, and then where you are right now, and try to figure out if that makes sense. And the generative part of it is we start with where you have been, and we try to see how reachable where you are is right now. So you could think of that as the prompt. Here's where they've been before. Here's where they are right now. Does this make sense for them? Which is why we've nicknamed this like the inverse recommender. If we knew what they had done all this before, would we have recommended this merchant to them? And that's how we go about it. Because the fraud problem always breaks down into two subcomponents. One is, what's in pattern behavior for you? And everyone's different. And what's in pattern behavior for a fraudster? And we're trying to tease those two things out. So one of my friends here at work is an angler, a fly fisherman at heart. It wouldn't be unusual for him to go to an online shop and buy some fly fishing equipment, and we would see that he's been to other places. So this is a totally new merchant for him. And we can infer that this would be a place he would go, but it wouldn't make any sense for me to be there. And that's the way we can identify what's in pattern for Wally and what's in pattern for Chris.
Let me just add to this interesting fact, because many people may not know this, but when we go for these models, we do not know, for instance, what you're buying. So while we know you go to a fly shop, I don't know what you buy. So when you buy from a grocery store, I don't know if you're buying a bunch of prepaid cards or whatever. All we have is the category of store that you're going to, the name of the store. We don't know really your name or your zip code where you live. We know where the merchant is that you're buying. We don't know what's in the basket. We literally just have an amount, which is why this problem is so intriguing and so hard to solve. If I knew that all of a sudden from, you go to a grocery store and you buy this and now all of a sudden you buy that, that could be very helpful. But we don't even have that depth of data. So we're dealing with a very high hierarchy of data with these models, which is what makes this so remarkable. And the amount of fraud is measured in basis points. It's not measured even in percentages. So you've got within the 160 billion transactions, a very small number of them are fraud. So your target is pretty small that you're trying to find here, which is why the tech is so cool to work with.
Are you testing lots of architectures? So that's really fascinating. And it makes sense from what you're describing as this being a string of events. It's perfect fit for an RNN. What about things like Mamba technology, the Mamba models and all the sort of new hybrid sort of things that are sort of not quite a full transformer, not quite an LSTM or RNN? Are those things that your team is actively sort of, work out, try those sorts of things?
The transaction has a life cycle. So sometimes you would log on to the merchant's website first, or you would do authentication if you're in Europe before, and something may happen post the transaction. So we'll also talk a lot about the concept of connected intelligence. If I know that you authenticated strongly when you got onto the website, even though I don't need the actual data, but if I have the signals that indicated a successful authentication using a biometric or whatever, those indicators then becomes powerful indicators when we look at the actual transaction value. So the ability to ingest external data from outside the transaction stream is another way in which Chris and the team have been able to kind of enhance the data and really connect the dots across these areas, which is also another neat technique which we can probably go into. But with the world is fragmenting a little bit now, Sam, as well. We've got a lot of data sovereignty going on around the world. People say, the data will not leave the soil here. So Chris and the team have been working on a lot of initiatives on how do you keep the underlying data on soil, but some of the variables, the aggregated data that's completely anonymized and not sensitive to any privacy concerns, those can be shared with the models globally. So you still can have the global patterns influencing every local decision, because that's, to his point, we take a year's worth of knowledge, context, and you squeeze it into a single transaction in 50 milliseconds to say yes or no, this is good or this is bad. And that context, I think, is where this is pretty interesting how they use the modeling techniques to achieve that.
So I want to keep focusing on the application and then how it evolves recently. But before we do, let's step back and talk about the history. My understanding is that there was a few years of where you had to push through several hurdles of getting this application really ready. Can you walk us through those hurdles? My understanding, it wasn't the model, but getting 4 separate engineering teams aligned. You had something called the data science engineering requirements document that sounds like it was a piece of Lego for getting everyone ready to build together. Can you both unpack that story for us in terms of how you got to where you are now?
I can start. So we actually met. I was in loyalty solutions before, and we had a situation for a co-brand card where we actually had department store data and I had SKU level data. And we, as Johan mentions, we don't actually get to see what people buy. So that's where I first started tinkering with recommender engines and this type of recurrent neural network structure. And when I showed up, I said, Johan, if you let me, the closest thing we have to SKU in our ecosystem is restaurants. I said, if you let me tinker with this restaurant recommender, I promise I'll eventually find a fraud solution. So my hat's off to Johan. We saw a futurist at RiskX who talked about if you want to become a futurist, you have to think about the Uber Morgan, not tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow. He had the patience to wait for the day after tomorrow, and we eventually did find a way to apply this to fraud and saying, would we have recommended this transaction to a person? So that was the genesis of the idea. But then over the years, there were some scalability issues. We had to get DI had to get rolled out first, and we had to have it be global and be able to do these kinds of weekly updates. And there were a lot of moving parts that needed to get in place. So When we finally felt like we had it ready to go into a development phase, one thing I see is there's really three phases. There's ideation, and there's activation, and then there's implementation. And a lot of companies go straight from ideation to implementation, and they don't go through the activation phase where you may go back down that R&D leg numerous times, getting the idea, making it better, and then you have to at some point galvanize the rest of the world. In our case, we're the AI lane, and then there's product and technology. We had to get all of those teams on board. What we found was when these engineering teams heard about what we were trying to do, they were all trying to eat the whole elephant. And so what we did was we created this document, and I mentioned the Lego blocks because I was reading this book on how big things get done, and they say, "What is your Lego?" And that's this modular thing that's reusable. Well, inside that document, there were three key drawings that captured the three phases of data science: data engineering, modeling, and deployment. Each one of those diagrams has four layers to it. There's the governance layer, there's the data layer, the platform layer, and the domain layer. And by making it real modular and then sharing it with the engineering teams, it became abundantly clear to them what they all needed to do. Oh, I should focus on the deployment module over here and add this inverse recommender capability to our inferencing platform, and so on. So we knew it was a success when in subsequent projects we were talking with the engineering teams and they said, well, that's all fine and dandy, but I'm not doing anything until I get a DSERD. So they've grown to expect these Lego blocks and where to look for what's their responsibility.
Yeah, and look, and I will add from an organizational point of view, we recognize that to build these models, you need data. But in our security solutions world, we've got very distinct domains or verticals. There's a cyber, there's an identity, there's a fraud, and there's a chargeback and dispute vertical. And a lot of our solutions are more vertically domain-based. But the power of the data is when you can stretch it horizontally across them. So it was an organizationally, it was a tough challenge to convince these independent leaders to say, let's give up our data scientists to get into this aspen tree growth where the collective underlying tissue will actually perform much better trees that will grow up ultimately if we do this together and so forth. And we started out small. We first connected a few of these and we're still expanding to that. Now that people understand and unlock the power, I think most organizations may struggle with this a little bit. Do I organize, by domain or do by principles? And I think we found this hybrid way, but the ability to bring the data scientists together. One of the things that Chris taught me on very early on was that data scientists do like to operate in herds. They do very well when they have a clear responsibility, but ability to expand their knowledge by learning new techniques. And once we got that unlocked, also flow through the organization, until we unlocked it in the organization, it was impossible to scale because people got too busy with their own vertical things. And so this was a really big unlock for us to finally get to this rollout.
So, Johan, I'm really interested to ask you, sort of as the leader of this organization, how do you make the decisions to sort of, decide, okay, we're going to go have the data scientists be product based, be sort of, more sort of wider roles. Also, I imagine, just physical location. You've got data scientists around the world. How do you get them to sort of work together? As the leader of the organization, what's your thinking about this? Like, it's very nice that Chris says you are really patient, but I'm sure there's probably you're under pressure from above, from below, from the sides as well.
Yeah, no, it's no kidding. But that's a good thing, right? That produces results ultimately. But in the end, we are a strong leadership team, but we don't do a consensus decision making. So what you do as a leader is you have your trusted advisors around you. You listen to the advice that they bring you, and ultimately you need to make a call. And so as we were contemplating this, I was thinking about what is going to provide the biggest amount of value, these isolated silos, or when I listen to our customers who are saying, I need you to solve my problem, not this individual product issue that I have. I need you to help me stop fraud. And in order to do that, we really need to connect the dots. And also when we looked at the competitors who we're dealing with, most of them were point solutions doing specific things. And we thought that our differentiation really is in the ability to connect through all of these things. once you had the mission defined, then the rest of the steps just start falling in place. And it's like, yeah, the organization has to be like this, otherwise we will not be successful. So we always say we're well-informed leaders, but it's not a democracy. So it comes with accountability, and you need to, take and be able to accept that accountability at the end to make it happen, but be well-informed with the right people like Chris, who can provide the data to help make these decisions.
What about things like the allocation of just resources, of deciding, okay, having data science work together, ideally you would like them to sit together, right, in a similar kind of location. I don't know if you can tell us a little bit about how big the actual sort of data science or ML team is, and how do you decide where you allocate those people across the world?
Yeah, look, I think the good thing about this is, allocating them across the world actually has multiple benefits. There's the follow the sun component of this, but there's also the diversity and backgrounds and insights that these data scientists bring, coming from different schools across the world, coming from different learning principles and disciplines that they bring in. That is the power. And so when you put these teams together, and it's okay to put them in different geographies, actually, I think this is very powerful because you can hand things off. It also means, technology nowadays allows us to speak to folks all around the world all the time if we need to. So location is not that big a deal. In fact, it's for us, it's our friend in multiple ways in terms of our follow the sun model, as well as just the deep, diverse views that we get around the table when we try to solve these problems. And I tell you, it is a thing of beauty when somebody in a different part of the world say, we couldn't solve this problem, pass it to somewhere else, and somebody's like, this is easy, we've done this in our school. And I was like, oh my gosh, okay. And so you learn, and then eventually the tide rises all boats. So I think there's a very strong message in diverse, multiple locations to actually solve these problems, and we're a global company. We're not solving problems just for one country around the world. We're solving it for consumers and merchants all around the world. So that for us is very, very important. I can't tell you exactly how big it is. It's sizable. It's well over 100 people. We'll start there. But Chris has done a wonderful job in how he creates the mechanisms and the framework for the data to flow, but you still have very clear deliverables in terms of that product needs to launch, because the person who's responsible for Decision Intelligence Pro, is different from the person that's responsible for Safety Net or for our digital transaction insights. These are all different products and things that we have, but ultimately they all share the underlying data. And so if somebody breaks the chain, the whole product kind of suffers. So it's a really great way of how that actually lay out, as well as across our different time zones as well.
Great. Johan is the person in charge of the solution, right? We've just heard from Chris on a couple of key parts of the stack, right? So there's that organizational change that I think took a few years to get right. You have the RNN, right? The network that you've chosen for this 50 milliseconds of decision making. From your standpoint, I'm wondering, what are the other elements of the stack that are worth calling attention to? My understanding is you had a key integration from Databricks that allowed the data to be organized in a more efficient way. Are there other significant layers that we should touch on?
The way this operates is we created this infrastructure called the Decision Management Platform. And basically what it is, it's a multi-layer stack where you have your data lake at the bottom. You've got your governance layer sitting on top of that. Then you've got your analytics and AI layer sitting on top of that. Then where your applications live, and then your access layers, APIs, UIs, all sorts of ways in which to access the results. That platform then has a component to it which we basically can refer to as a service bus. Every transaction that gets routed from our network into the service bus now can get orchestrated for application on, I need to get a decision intelligence score, I need to get a safety net evaluation. Because I'm a transaction from bank X, I need to apply this service or that service. So these things are very individualized. That's the stack within which this operates, which today is an on-prem place. But we realized we needed a lot more speed in how quickly we update and build these models and develop the new techniques. And that's, I think, where Databricks really came in to unlock a bunch of things for us. For many organizations like us who are publicly traded and the financial industry where we're heavily regulated, those are big decisions. Do I move some of this stuff out in the cloud or not? So these were big decisions for us, big discussions. But the data has proven over and over again that if you anonymize the data, it's encrypted, where all the security guards are there, then the amount of benefits and the cycles and the speed through which we can do innovation. I mean, you may have, I don't know if you have a number, but I've seen just some drastic, we went from months to hours in some of our innovation aspects and some of our R&D runs and so forth. Just having that elasticity in computing power and the availability of some of these computing resources and other resources to punch through some of these tasks much faster. It really unlocked and enabled our data scientists to now come up, and our engineers to come up with brand new different allocations of ideas. So it's the whole concept of the more I can automate, the more I can do these things faster, the more I give freedom to innovation to happen in other different places. And that's really what this done for us. It opened up capacity to go and innovate around a whole bunch of different things and have more resource availability for that, which was really helpful.
Guys, do you feel that that's a must-have for sort of incorporating Gen AI into what you're doing, that you need this huge amount of compute, you need this very efficient sort of cloud, those sorts of things?
I do, yeah, I believe that it would be, we did the math, and it would have taken us a decade, I think, if we were to purely use in-house resources. We call it DI Pro as if it's one model, but we actually break it up into different regions, and some regions have subcomponents. So we had to, be able to do this for multiple regions at the same time. We wouldn't have been able to do that in the current environment and let anyone else get anything done. So it's definitely vital.
I imagine that at your scale too, that if you did decide to do it in-house, it's almost like you're having to build a mini sort of cloud company inside your organization, which you don't really want to do because it's not your expertise. It's better to go to Databricks, etc.
100%. I think that's exactly right, and that's just about being smart about how you use where your superpowers are, where your real mission is, and where you simply need to use whatever elasticity you have. Also, and it's not just the elasticity; it is, companies like that, they invest in making sure that you have the latest and greatest tools. That's the competitive environment that they have. If Databricks doesn't serve it anymore, somebody else will. So you benefit from that innovation and drive there and the specialization that happens for the purpose of getting to your mission.
Johan, so it's clear that with Chris's help, you've built this incredible, reliable machine for classic AI, right? Or what people generally consider classical AI. Now the whole world is obsessed with generative AI. How are you layering Gen AI on top of this foundation? We've heard about the work you're doing with Recorded Future, that big acquisition, a threat intelligence company. I don't know if that plays into it, but could you walk us through how Mastercard is looking at that?
Yeah, so it's actually a great example. So Recorded Future already uses Gen AI very effectively today to do a couple of things. So for instance, they have this massive intelligence graph. We believe it's the world's largest intelligence graph. Other folks may disagree with us, but it's large either way. And they have a layer of Gen AI that actually acts as a translation layer between consumers wanting to extract meaningful intelligence in a human consumable format out of the masses, connecting the dots, finding the related pieces of data for us. In addition, we just launched a couple of weeks ago at our Predict conference, we launched autonomous agents, threat hunting agents. So think of it almost as antibodies in your body where these things will kind of go through your body, and if it finds a vulnerability, it will congregate there and fix the problem. So we're doing the same with generative AI, where I can deploy this in my systems through Recorded Future, and it will find these cyber vulnerabilities, call attention to it, make sure that these things get fixed in an automated way. Now, that's already within the Recorded Future area. Now, we also launched at the beginning of October this year what we call Mastercard Threat Intelligence, and it actually bridges these two worlds. So we're taking the intelligence that generative AI will extract from the intelligence graph. In this case, it could be things as simple as we just picked up that a card number has just been sold on the dark web, and we've seen this test transaction at the dating agency that Chris was referring to. That intelligence is extracted by Gen AI, fed into our decision intelligence models to now create a real-time flag. So when we see that transaction next time on this specific card that has an elevated level of risk, we automatically will deal with it differently. And so we're already, since October, we're in that phase where we're starting to bridge these two. It's still not a Gen AI model on top of this, but it's extracts from Gen AI that feeds into our RNN models to make that better, and just more, I would say, very pointed intelligence that brings the intelligence into an actionable insight.
Great. So sounds like a lot of things with that and threat intelligence company that you're doing with Gen AI, and that's can you double click on where do you think that Gen AI is going to go through the rest of the org? Is it going to stay in the recorded future element? You've talked about the bridge starting to happen, but can you double click on one of the things that I think it's a big deal is this idea that Gen AI is a stochastic model, right? It's not deterministic. I mean, maybe you could say the same thing around RNNs, but I think they're probably slightly more deterministic in terms of a set pattern. Um, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll tell you, this is the beautiful thing about these acquisitions. There's of course the investor side of things where you bring these technologies together or these products together and what it means from us from a financial point of view. But a tremendous amount of this power comes in terms of the knowledge that you acquire through these. And when you put the two together, we've done it, Chris's world, which is a good example of how much work we've done around AI to do things like productivity, to do things around our loyalty business. We've launched commerce media the other day, which has some of that entrenched into. Now you put our engineers together like what we did for DI, where you start building those horizontal integrations, and you can get the benefits of what we have in recorded future with some of the use cases we have here. There's a tremendous amount of potential there for us to go. And so that's part of what we want to do, is to extract that juice when you bring these data engineers, data scientists, modelers together on what we. So I foresee a big lift there for the company holistically, but also for them to learn from some of the techniques that we've learned over the years, given our scale and our data and the diversity of our data together with the diversity of theirs. They have threat intelligence. We have intelligence around every fraud transaction on a Mastercard card gets reported to Mastercard. So we have a tremendous amount of intelligence. Every time somebody says, this is not my transaction, or I ordered the blue sweater and you send me the red one, all of those events are labeled in our data. So there's a lot of learnings that can lift both of these companies, which is why we're so excited about this. One of the other applications of Gen AI for recorded future is we also launched a malware sandbox. So companies can send the malware into recorded future. It will actually execute the malware, and then the Gen AI will extract the unique signatures and actually write the queries to then go and hunt and find, do you have some of those signatures in your systems? So we've just automated a whole string of events where in the past, a manual data scientist process would have extracted the signatures, would have been passed to a data scientist or to an engineer to go and write what we call Yara queries. And then those Yara queries would be put into your system, your threat hunting system. All of that is now automated. Now imagine I can put more signatures into those systems. I can feed signatures out of that system into other systems. That's where the power of this can go. And I think that's where, when you bring these two groups together, I'm really excited about what this will do for innovation for us going forward.
Johan, do you see that as being sort of the biggest advantage of perhaps this sort of agentic AI that's coming along? This sort of, where these agents can make decisions, can sort of analyze the malware, go out there, do different things. Is that something that you're sort of, laying the landscape for going forward with that kind of stuff?
That's a big focus from us from a product point of view. If you look at Mastercard more in general, what GenAI will do for us from, how do we change the way in which we build products? So there's the internal component, and it's not just an efficiency play or a productivity play. It's a quality play as well. In terms of the speed to get to market, the speed to get to quality market. If you speak to some of the cybersecurity folks, they actually make a valid argument in that we don't have a cybersecurity problem. We have a poor software engineering problem. Because if we don't have these vulnerabilities, if we have security by design, we shouldn't have to worry about cybersecurity as much as we do right now, especially with some of the vulnerabilities. Some of the stuff should just be solved. But I see Gen AI as something that can help us to get speed with greater accuracy in terms of our product development. There's, of course, the efficiency plays and productivity plays in that I don't have to write everything down. I can have that do it for me. So there's automation that this can drive. So there's a lot of internal impact. And then there is the impacts from our products and just differentiating and how, because we are sitting on such a treasure trove of data. And keep in mind, we'll always go back to the responsibility we have around making sure we keep you as a consumer's privacy safe and all those. We'll never compromise on that. But the volume and the diversity of data that you have with this AI, the new types of products, the new types of value adds that we can do we always talk about, we want to make our transactions smarter. We might want to make them safer. And we want to be more productive as well. So there are multiple layers, and we see that AI layer running through all of these layers at the company, well beyond just product development.
Johan, this is fascinating. This cloak and dagger world of the good guys trying to follow the bad guys with these new agents that are threat hunting. And you conjured up when you talk about these signature patterns, and then being able to have systems that are feeding into other systems. MCP comes up, right? This idea that you can't do it all yourself, and that maybe these big banks are working with you in some ways and having their own agents that maybe borrow on an MCP from you and vice versa. Can you talk a little bit? Or am I getting a little too far afield here, or actually are you working on this?
No, we're actively working on this. So there's a lot of work being done on our MCP layers to make sure that we can propagate this and make it available to other agents out there as well. So that's a big focus for us, as well as just in general, our API layers. Our API layers needs to be done right, and then our MCP will sit on top of that. So it's a very big focus for us. One of the things philosophically we see ourselves as doing as a company is we connect the dots across the world. We facilitate the flow of that intelligence, and of course, we can add our piece, our global perspective into that as well. But one of the biggest benefits we can do is when I have an assessment of risk, or the context of what happened when you logged onto the merchant's website, how did you authenticate, are you from the same device, you're always doing it, all that contextual intelligence. When we can transport that to the bank that needs to make the decision and provide that assurance and trust, that's the power that we bring. And we see the MCP as a way to now, at the agentic level, to do the same thing, to connect these stakeholders and to provide that intelligence and to federate smart intelligence, so that ultimately, it's all about trust for us. And trust is not beholden to one single party. So we see this something that we should federate and empower folks to do better.
Johan, on the background call that we talked about, you talked about the whole idea of sort of going on the offensive, right? And I guess we're kind of talking that with making APIs available, making MCPs available. You had a fascinating thing that you told us a little bit about scamming the scammers and using GenAI for that. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
It's a wonderful thing when we take the fight a little bit to them as well, because they cause us enough pain as it is. But there are some companies out there who are doing a wonderful job, who's actually using GenAI to set up the old concept of what was referred to as honeypots in the world of cyber. But you've got these places where the agents or the scammers will try to scam this agent. And the agent will engage in a conversation with the scammer and will go up to the point where the scammer asks you to provide the bank, or provides you with a bank account where you need to transfer the money into. The moment we have that bank account, now you've got the smoking gun. Now you've got a Mule account that was established by the criminals for the purpose of transferring these funds. That becomes extremely powerful. So when you take that Mule account, we also, if you go back to graph technology, when I start applying the graph technology in terms of which accounts are linked to which accounts, now I can see this account that was revealed through the Mule scam is linked to all of these other accounts. And you can start lifting out these Mule networks out of the financial system, which is a fascinating place to be as well. And it's a wonderful way to just go on the offense a little bit more and take in the fight to them and really be disruptive in the way that we can disable their networks. Because ultimately, in order to scam an individual, I need to have a bank account to which you're going to pay the money. And then I need at least 10 other accounts to kind of layer and wash that money through the banking system to get it out of the system again. And so the more we can disrupt that ecosystem is very, very important. If you look at payment card fraud, so we're not talking about bank fraud or account-to-account fraud, but payment card fraud specifically, as a percentage of overall volume, is lower now than it was before COVID, which means our business is growing at a slower rate than fraud is growing. Now, every dollar of fraud is an unacceptable dollar of fraud, so we should start there. So none of this is going to mean we think our job is done or we're winning the race. That'll never be the case, because it's still in the billions of dollars of fraud that gets perpetrated, which means we have people like Chris that wakes up every morning and say, we need to take this fight to them. But the technology has really helped us to make a meaningful dent, specifically on the card fraud side. Now we're looking at how do we take that to the account-to-account and the scam space and really help the consumer to also make better decisions in that front.
You've both talked about this incredible journey in AI building Gen AI on top, having a significant acquisition to bring some of the Gen AI magic into the product. If you were to look at, take a step back and look at the industry, maybe some of your competitors, how would you look at your differentiation, and what are you particularly proud of when it comes to some of these trends that are obviously moving incredibly fast? And maybe it's a tough question because it's hard to look over the shoulder and see what everyone else is doing in the market. But I'm curious how you would see Mastercard's particular differentiation here.
A wise friend once told me, when we obsess over the client instead of our competitors, we'll always do the right thing. And that's kind of always where we start. We start with how do we get close to our clients, and then out of that, the goodness will follow. So from a philosophical point of view, that's how we approach a lot of this. Start with the customer, start with the problems we want to solve. Now, when it comes to fraud and trust, I want to be very clear. We work with everybody and anybody. I don't care if it's Visa, Amex, Pix in Brazil, UPI in India, because trust in the electronic payment system is foundational for us, period. So on that area, we all want to be the same. And that's why we form groups like EMV Co. and PCI Co. and all these places where industry can collectively establish trust. What I'm most proud of in terms of where we differentiate is we're seeing these tools that Chris built as an enabler for our customers to differentiate and grow sustainably. Many people don't like it when I say this, but this is when security professionals view themselves as bodyguards, not wardens. It's not our responsibility to lock things and make sure they don't happen. It's our responsibility to make sure they can get out there and grow, but wrapped with security and design around them. And so one of the missions we see ourselves doing is we have to make sure our core is secure, which is our network. Then we have to allow our customers to build their business models and differentiate and compete in wonderful ways. So we see security as an enabler of sustained growth. And that's been our mission. I think that's what I feel most proud of. Where most people talk about, look how great we are in keeping fraud low. It's like, no, look at how we help the business grow. Look at how we facilitated growth and our customers to differentiate. I would say that would be, for us, the most proudest achievement that we have.
We're coming towards the end. I want to sort of get some advice from you for our listeners. What would you sort of advise people, as say, executives from large organizations that perhaps aren't as far down the path of AI as Mastercard is? What do you think are the key things to think about? Not perhaps just from a technology point of view, but from a culture point of view, from an implementation point of view.
Yeah, look, I think it all starts with having an open, pragmatic mind to the new technology, and just be very disciplined about it. We went through a phase where everybody wanted to do a use case on Gen AI. You very quickly realize that you need good talent with good technology to get great outcomes. So make sure you get the right talent. And, I'll go back, I'll give Chris all the credit. The first time we met, I realized this is great talent, because the way he could articulate, the way he could explain, and the results that he's been putting on the table. If you have the right talent, then have that open mind to get the priorities right. We gave Chris a lot of freedom to go and do a few things, but when it came to where do we spend our money and how do we prioritize, it came down to data-driven decisions that made sense and fits with the mission where our customers want us to be. So it goes back to the customer-centric, what is it we're trying to solve? And then I have got these underlying things. And then just relentless prioritization. You have to make some really tough decisions. Otherwise, you will have 1,000 flowers blooming and nothing really big. So DI Pro for us was, this has to work. And so we cut off a lot of smaller things in order to make sure this works. And then we have the resources to make this as big and as powerful as it is, versus trying to do 7 different things that are kind of like, this is interesting, but this is big and meaningful in the scale. And now the beautiful thing of this is, with the success of this, you inspire new ideas, you inspire new use cases, other people trying to find ways to use the same technology technique. So I think hopefully that is helpful for a bit of a framework, but you need the right talent. You need to be able to experiment a little bit, but then you need to relentlessly prioritize and make sure, what Chris has described very, very well are the trident. You've got your R&D, you've got your build, and then you've got your deploy, and you've got your run. If you really focus on that framework in terms of how you deploy these things and make sure that you resource them accordingly to have a successful execution, that certainly helped us a lot. And then the organizational design, I always say, your organizational design should facilitate the outcomes that you want to get. If you think I want this outcome, so I'll just ask the organizations to kind of figure this out. It's not going to work. Your design needs to be pointed towards those outcomes that you want to get. Otherwise, it will not work. We've bumped our heads on that wall several times in the past.
A fascinating story. Thank you for opening up on everything you've done there. Wow, it feels like you've accomplished so much, but at the same time, we're still at such early days, right? From the Gen AI side and agentic and everything that's happening. Really going to be interested in following this story going forward. So thank you very much for joining us here.
No, thank you for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
And special thanks to our presenting sponsor, Outshift by Cisco. You can learn more about their work on the Internet of Agents via their Linux Foundation project, agntcy.org. This open source project enables agents to work at scale across any vendor or framework with trusted and secure discovery, identity access, and observability. For more stories about the AI revolution, like and subscribe to the podcast and check out VentureBeat.com to sign up for our newsletters.